When I look back on my 20 plus years of language learning, there is one big mistake that I really wish I hadn't made, and I want to help you guys avoid making the same mistake. As you guys know, I strongly recommend using a spaced repetition program to augment your language learning, something like Anki. As you probably already know, Anki's repetition algorithm is amazingly effective at helping you get things pushed from short-term memory into long-term memory. But there's one catch that a lot of us wind up missing. So the catch here is that you're supposed to actually learn the material before you stick it into Anki. That's right, Anki works best if you actively spend time and effort learning the material first before you stick it in your deck. In other words, telling yourself that, oh, you know what, I'm going to stick this into this deck first, and when it comes up, I'll take a couple of minutes to look it up, and then I'll, figure it out then. That approach doesn't work. Trust me, I know, I've tried it, I've done it, and I've been doing it the wrong way for years and years. In fact, I'll give you an example. 16 years and about 50 pounds ago, I started learning Korean. This was actually part of my job with the United States Foreign Service, believe it or not. My job back then was to go to the Foreign Service Institute every day and learn Korean. And back then I had Korean class every day, of course. It was my job. I think we had like 5 hours of class a day plus some time to study like in the Foreign Service Institute and also at home and so on. And that's where my problems with the language started. As you probably know, Korean is a difficult language, even if the written text is a lot easier to learn than Chinese. Korean grammar is particularly difficult, especially with all the various sentence endings that can significantly change the mode and the mood of the sentence. It really didn't help that much that we used a dated and stiff textbook to complement our classroom learning. But then again, it could have been a lot worse. Alright, I'll give you a secret about these old FSI textbooks. You see these things like passed around online for free all the time. The truth is that nobody uses them. Well, except for the autodidacts who are looking for any sort of free textbook that they can find. So when I was at FSI, they gave us a consular specific textbook in Korean. Consular meaning, American citizen services abroad or doing visa interview, stuff like that. Like, it's okay if you want to do a basic visa interview, though as I recall, and I don't have the book anymore, I threw it away. As I recall, like, it would go really specific into like technical legal language that we would never actually say to somebody on the line, right? Honestly, overall, the textbook was complete garbage. Even worse, though, was the reality of what it was we were being asked to do. So some of you have probably seen this chart before. This is FSI's chart of how difficult certain languages are. Korean should, in theory, take 88 weeks for a native English speaker to learn from zero. Now, I was a little bit unique in that I was posted to Shenyang, China, which meant that learning Korean was actually a bonus. And see, I was learning this language mostly to talk with like a couple people of Korean descent who would come to the consulate for whatever reason, and they didn't really speak Chinese at all, or their Chinese wasn't that good. Now, I can understand that they would give me a limited time to learn Korean because Chinese was the official language at the post, and I'd already tested out to the necessary level in Chinese. But the truth is, they only gave me 30 weeks to learn this 88-week language before I had to ship out. That was nowhere near enough time, believe me. I did what I could and I crammed in as much as was humanly possible. The thing is though that 30 weeks is only so much time, and it's not really possible or realistic to expect significant progress in a language like Korean during that time. And what's worse is that I wound up breezing through the grammar lessons in order to try to desperately learn as much vocabulary as I could for the test in the end. As a result, my foundation in the language was wobbly, and this was a problem that stuck with me for years and years. And that's where I really started to make mistakes. Now, the good news is that I kept studying Korean even when I got to Shenyang. I went as far as to hire like a native speaking tutor to help me out. The bad thing though is that I also started to look for shortcuts. So believe it or not, you actually can use Korean in Shenyang, China, especially if you go up to the famous Shitajie or Sodapka. Sure, it's a red light district and it can be really sketchy at times, but it still is a fascinating mix of South Korea, North Korea, and China all kind of crammed in together. When we left Shenyang, however, that's where my mistakes were compounded. So it was around that time that I finally discovered Anki, as well as the world of pre-made Anki decks. And, the temptation to save time studying by just downloading one of these babies was way too strong for me to resist. And so I jumped straight into that shortcut. I put a whole bunch of like cards someone else had made into my deck, and I wound up damaging my knowledge of the language even more than it had already been damaged. Anyway, I'll stop with the sob story here. Now let's look together at precisely what went wrong. You see, I didn't know this at the time, but I unwittingly broke the most basic rule of long-term learning, and not just language learning, but learning anything. I tried to memorize stuff before I really understood it. Okay, let me introduce you here to SuperMemo, which is language learning software that competes with Anki. SuperMemo is the OG of language learning tools. In fact, for years, the Anki repetition algorithm was a modified version of a SuperMemo algorithm. And yeah, there are still people out there who think SuperMemo is superior to Anki for whatever reason. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, I'm not really all that geeky about like the specifics of the algorithms that they use. You're not going to see me go into any depth about this stuff on this channel. It's not really interesting to me. There are other YouTube channels out there that will tell you about like optimizing this stuff. Sometimes they tell you something useful, sometimes it's not so useful. Take it with a grain of salt. Now, I want to point you instead to the SuperMemo blog, which is really one of the most important sources of information out there about spaced memory. And a lot of people forget about this. So if you look at the Anki manual, you'll see a bunch of technical information, like what a card is, what a deck is, what kind of card types you can make, that sort of thing. In contrast, if you look at the SuperMemo blog, you will find all sorts of useful articles about memory and how knowledge is actually formulated. And the best of those articles is this one, the 20 Rules of Formulating Knowledge. This article was written back in 1999, and yet up to today it is still cited all over the place by all sorts of people who are trying to explain what actually works when you use a program like Anki. And there's a reason for that, of course, because it actually works, right? What we want to look at today, though, is the most basic part of how actual long-term language learning works, and learning for anything, right? This counts for learning math, learning language, or learning pretty much anything it is you can possibly think of. The very first SuperMemo rule is simple. You cannot learn something if you don't understand it first. Okay, so let's say you wanted to learn everything in this German book about German history between 1871 and 1918, but you can't actually speak German. Now, in theory, you could go through this book line by line and word by word and try to cram everything into your brain without actually understanding what any of these words mean. Maybe some of these diagrams would help you get a clue as to what's going on, I don't know. While it is theoretically possible to learn this way, the time it takes is absolutely extreme. Now, this isn't always your fault. So as SuperMemo says here, sometimes your exam deadline can't move and you have to use a crappy textbook. And worst of all, you might blame yourself for your own inability to learn from an awful textbook. This is one of the reasons why language learning in the classroom so often backfires, right? It's almost impossible for you to actually learn something and keep it long term if you don't actually understand it. Like, sure, you can memorize it, right? So once upon a time, I knew this lady who was older. She's from Taiwan. She was about 20 years older than me, 30 years actually, something like that. She grew up Buddhist, and she had learned various prayers and chants that were transliterated into Chinese from, I think it was from Sanskrit. So you could say the words, right? But she didn't know what they meant. And so, like, you can memorize the sound of something, but it's meaningless to you, right? Memorizing something is not the same thing as actually learning it. If your goal is to learn a language, you need to actually start learning. Anyway, how do we overcome this problem? That brings us to point number 2. We need to actually learn the material first before we memorize it. As it says here, when you have individual pieces of knowledge that fit into a single coherent mental structure, the learning time will be dramatically reduced. In other words, the dozens of Korean grammatical particles are going to seem totally random and impossible until you can take a step back and see how everything fits in together. Now, can you see where I ran into issues? So the problem that I went through at the Foreign Service Institute was that it was designed, like the program was designed to pour the knowledge into my brain, but it wasn't really designed for long-term language learning. It was about getting this concept covered today and then move on to that concept tomorrow with minimal time for review and practice, mostly to like check off the box, right? This is one of those cases where government efficiency got in the way of actual quality, something that you see a lot in the government. And the whole purpose of it was to get the students to have enough of the language to pass the big test at the end, right? Which is something that honestly requires many, many years of careful learning, study, and understanding, not a whole bunch of cramming. Now, we did use an Anki clone program back then called Rapid Road. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the software anymore, but it seems like someone or other in government still uses it, I guess. This was basically a centralized flashcard program that was similar to Anki, except without the algorithm and with no emphasis at all on long-term learning. Once upon a time, that same company, Transparent Language, offered a bunch of shovelware similar to Glossika, Rosetta Stone, and all of the other one-size-fits-all language approaches. Anyway, that Rapid Road program was really, really bad. Like, you couldn't customize it at all. Your only option, if I remember right, was to basically just go through everything and it wouldn't save your progress. I used it for like 2 weeks and then I went back to making my own flashcards by hand. But the problem really was not just the software. It was that fundamental lack of linguistic understanding, which was caused by going way too quickly. Now, part of what makes Korean difficult is the way different styles of speech are separated grammatically. It's kind of unique in that sense. It's the sort of language where you really need to build on top of a solid foundation to understand the language's internal logic. And honestly, even the best textbooks out there are often guilty of making simple Korean concepts a lot harder than they really need to be. It took me years to find it, but the best I've seen are carefully designed guides like How to Study Korean, which of course is free. But the key to making this work is to actually understand what you're learning first. You got to understand the concept, you got to go through the sample sentences, you got to make sure you understand those, and then you stick this stuff into like your Anki deck or into your flashcards or whatever. Now, cramming like crazy for a test in 2 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever, that's not going to help. You have to make sure you actually understand it first. If you don't understand it, you got to take the time to go through it so you can understand it. And only then can you go through with the effort of trying to memorize it. If you spend time on the Anki subreddit, you'll see questions like this asked over and over again. How do you use the software the right way? The answer is very simple. You need to be actively engaging with the material and understanding it before it goes into your Anki deck. This 2,400 note deck is the most popular Korean deck, but even still, I strongly recommend that you don't just download it and expect it to teach you everything. So if you're anything like me, you will tell yourself that you'll look this stuff up if you don't know it when it comes around in your Anki deck, right? You come across a sentence, you're like, I don't know what that word means. You're saying, oh, well, perfect. I will look it up right now and learn it. If you have that voice in your head, do not listen to it because that voice is lying to you. The truth is that you'll get to this and you'll be like, well, I'm going to fudge. I don't get it, but I'm just going to put it off as, I understand it so I can get to the next card so I can get done with this, right? The truth is that Anki study is most effective if it is very quick and efficient. Everything that you learn really needs to be bite-sized. That means you have no time to waste in your Anki study chasing after like dictionary definitions or trying to read really long paragraphs or whatever. Get rid of all that stuff. Keep it short and simple. Make sure that the cards are teaching you the points that you need to learn or to remember, and make sure that you've learned it and you've understood it first. And seriously, if you're trying to go through 500 new cards a day, you're going to hate your life. And for crying out loud, please do not push yourself to spend 8 hours in a single day just going through Anki cards. So the thing you have to understand about Anki is that it's really built for long-term learning, not for short-term cramming. In fact, cramming is really, really bad for learning, right? So when I was in college, I remember spending hours writing Chinese characters over and over again to prepare for tests, right? Like I would write it over and over again until I had it down and I had the muscle memory down, go take the test, I would pass the test, and then I would stop writing the characters and I would forget how to write them, right? It doesn't work. Cramming doesn't work. Your goal should be long-term understanding, not short-term cramming for a test. Anki is not built for short-term learning, and focusing way too much on cramming will only hurt your memory in the long term, just like it did with my attempt to learn Korean. Honestly, in hindsight, I wish I would have spent more time watching Korean television and less time memorizing grammar. The thing about language grammar is that it's something that is felt more than it is something that you just memorize. Even if you don't fully understand what is being said, listening to the rhythm and pace of the language can help you immensely with your comprehension. And of course, you can also go back in after the fact. You can take what you've learned and you can turn it into your own Anki cards. But you've got to make sure that you understand it first. You should always understand everything that you're going to stick into Anki before you stick it in there. And yes, that means that you shouldn't go blindly download somebody else's Anki deck and stick it in with your cards and expect that it's going to work. If you are pinning your hopes and dreams on Anki magically teaching you everything when the card shows up, you will be disappointed. Trust me, I've been through this, I've done it the wrong way, and I still have a whole bunch of cards I have to get rid of. Don't do it this way, do it the right way, go slowly and put things in Anki that you understand. And if you don't understand it, figure out how it works. Go ask the AI chatbot for help, right? Go find a native speaker and ask them for help. Go post about it on a forum or something like that. But make sure that you actually understand it before you stick it into Anki.